Samma sambuddhassa, namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa, namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa, aparutate sang amatassa dvara yesodvanto punchantu sadhanti. So welcome back everybody for the third session in our series on Kamma and Rebirth in early Buddhism. And for this session, what I'd like to do is to examine a little bit more closely the historical background in the time of the Buddha. And I perhaps should explain a little bit the reasons why I want to do this and why I think it's very important. Now you think about, for a moment, just reflect on how we normally approach the Dhamma. Okay? How do you normally come to know about the Dhamma? Right? So normally we come to know about it because, well, you come to a talk, you hear words that are being spoken, okay, and I'm talking about these teachings and so on. Now, as I'm talking, right, this Dhamma that I'm talking, which hopefully is Dhamma, but this Dhamma that I'm talking is the very latest Dhamma that there is, okay? This is the Dhamma that's happening right now, and that's the very latest Dhamma that is. It's the furthest Dhamma in time from the time of the Buddha. Right? And that's normally how we learn, isn't it? We learn from what's around us. We learn from what's present, from teachers and people and books and so on that are around in our time. And it's only natural that would happen. And so when that happens, then of course we naturally will interpret and filter the Dhamma through what is present, through the technologies, the culture, the ideas, the feeling, the events. These things all colour our perception and shape the way that we see things and the way that we approach the Dhamma. And you know, maybe we hear a Dhamma talk, and then that Dhamma talk is from a monk who's maybe read books in the past and maybe done meditation to get experience and so on, and then so we're going gradually backwards, and then they heard it from another teacher and they heard it from another teacher, and so we go this kind of slow, laborious way back to eventually arrive maybe at something that the Buddha taught, maybe not. But what we're seeing is an adaptation of the Buddha's teachings. And very often that's all we really see. So if we come to look at actually what the Buddha himself taught, in front of what the Buddha taught in the suttas, we will inevitably read them in the same way, right? We will read those suttas as if they were responding to us, right? As if they were responding to our situation and our time. Yeah? And that's how conditioning works. That's how the mind works. And this is something that I always tell my students when you're reading the suttas. Right? The biggest flaw that you can have, the biggest mistake you can make when reading the suttas is to try to make them relevant. Right? This is number one mistake. You read the suttas and you say, how are they relevant for me? Well, you've immediately assumed from the beginning that they are relevant for you. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it was relevant for somebody all that time ago and it's not relevant for you. And you will never know that if you make your assumption from the beginning that it's going to be relevant for you. Okay? So if we want to read the suttas and really hear what they're saying, rather than us reading our ideas into the suttas, we want to read the Buddha's ideas out of the suttas. Okay? So we have to begin by trying to distance ourselves from our own situation, our own biases, our own preconceptions. Right? Now this is what, for example, this is what a scientist will do, won't they? If someone's doing some research, you want to do a survey, you want to investigate a particular problem, you make the experiment in a way that, you know, you're not just going to confirm your biases, you want to actually test them. Right? So you have to actually be able to test the information. So once we've done that, and once we've figured out actually what the Buddha was saying, what was he talking about, what did this mean to those people at that time, then we can meaningfully begin to ask the question, what does that mean for me in my time? Right? And that actually becomes a real question, and we can then find and look at and explore ways that the Dhamma becomes relevant. Right? Can you see this difference? It's the difference between assuming that what's spoken there has the same meaning as it has for us, and the idea that it's for inquiry and for testing. So the best way, or one of the best ways of getting that sense of objectivity and distance from the suttas to begin with is by looking back in history. Rather than going back from our time looking at the suttas, from the future looking back, okay, the people in the Buddha's time were coming from the other direction, weren't they? They were coming from the past moving forward. They weren't interpreting, the teaching on dependent origination in the light of the theory of relativity or quantum mechanics or evolution or something, right? They were interpreting that in the light of the teachings maybe of the Vedas or maybe the Jaina teachings or other teachings that were available in the culture at that time, okay? That's the lens through which they saw the teachings. And so if we spend a little bit of time to familiarise ourselves with that world, with those ideas, with those people, with how they thought, then we can begin to get a sense of why the Dhamma was so powerful, why it was so revolutionary. And one of the things that strikes me again and again and again when I'm looking at the Buddha's teachings is that the revolutions, multiple revolutions, which the Buddha started, okay, are not finished by any means, right? There's still things that we are still trying to learn, right? You think of how the Buddha related to animals, right? The idea that each animal is a sentient, conscious being, whose life is valuable and which should never be killed, right? That idea is something that our society is still so far behind in catching up. We're just beginning to catch up on a few things and beginning to realise, that animals are conscious, that they deserve to be treated with kindness, but we're still so far behind where the Buddha was 2,500 years ago. That's just one example. Could have chosen many, many other examples. So let me talk a little bit about the history of India and that period leading up to the time of the Buddha, and then how that manifested in the Buddha's day. Okay. So the first thing you need to do, and in the last session we did some myth busting, and I mentioned one of the myths that needs busting is a myth of Hinduism. And this is something which is very, very prevalent. Almost everybody believes this myth of Hinduism, which is just not true. And we need to go beyond this. What do I mean by this myth of Hinduism? Well, it's this myth that India is a Hindu country. It always has been and it always will be. This timeless Dhamma, right? It's historically just not true at all. And this view was taught, of course, by the Hindu historians because, well, that's the world they wanted to live in, so they taught their point of view, so fair enough. Right? And when the Western scholars first learnt about ancient India and ancient Indian history during the 19th century, that's the point of view that they picked up. But it didn't take long at all for them to realise that wasn't really the case. And in particular, what happened was, specifically the most important thing that happened was that Thomas Rhys Davids and the other Pali scholars went to Sri Lanka and they read the Sri Lankan histories and what had happened in India. And then they started to recover the archaeology of ancient India, right? The Ashokan inscriptions, the sites at Bodh Gaya, the holy sites, and all of these kinds of things. And they realized that the story which is told by the archaeology matches up pretty well with the story told by the Buddhist history. And it didn't match up at all with the story which was told by the Hindu history. Okay? So this is why we know that this idea that India has always been a Hindu country, this idea is simply false, and we can't think that way. And if we're thinking in that way when we're looking at the Buddha's life, we will always misinterpret things. Of course, some Hindus today like to say that the Buddha was born as a Hindu, lived as a Hindu, and died as a Hindu. And with deep gratitude and respect for my wonderful Hindu friends, I have to say the Buddha had never heard of Hinduism. Okay? And if you ask the Buddha, are you a Hindu? He'd say, what are you talking about? Yeah? Now, think about what we mean when we talk about modern Hinduism, right? Okay, so we talk about the gods of Hinduism, Shiva, Ganesh, Vishnu, Skanda, Krishna, Rama, and so on. None of those existed in the time of the Buddha. Okay? None of those are mentioned at all. Okay, if they are mentioned, names might occur once or twice here and there, which might have some vague connection. But basically, these gods didn't exist. Temples didn't exist. Imagine Hinduism without temples. Right? Mahabharata, didn't exist. Ramayana didn't exist. Bhagavad Gita didn't exist. Right? The whole bhakti cult didn't exist. Okay? So all of these things, which are very central to our idea of what Hinduism is, are simply not found in the time of the Buddha. So what did exist? Right? So what was there, and how did that relate to what the Buddha was doing? Okay? So what I'll talk a bit about is the complexity of the religious situation in the time of the Buddha. Now, first thing to understand is that what actually is the dominant religion of not only India, right, but of the whole world, okay? And if there is one religion which has a claim to be a truly universal and timeless religion, what is that? And that religion is animism, okay? This is the basic religious belief and practice of pretty much all of humanity, and it has been as long as our records go back. And you find it today in every Buddhist culture, and all through India, all through Asia, all through Africa, all through the Americas, okay? In modern times, our generation really is perhaps the first generation really just to abandon that idea of animism in any bulk scale. What do we mean by animism? Well, animism is not a philosophical religion. It's not a contemplative religion. It's not a religion of doctrine or of books. It's a religion of spirits, especially spirits of nature and spirits of places and so on. It's a religion which is going to, putting a little shrine at the front of your house and offering a bit of rice to your shrine every day, which you see all the people in Thailand do. They have all their spirit houses, or in the Chinese culture, then they always have the little shrine or little altar they have in their house, and they'll come and make a little offering there every day and so on. In Burma, they have the similar things with the Nats and so on. In Vietnam, it's the same thing. And if you look at, for example, at the in Australia, at the indigenous culture and Aboriginal beliefs and so on, also is very similar, right? There are spirits of nature, spirits of place, spirits in the waters, spirits in the mountains and the trees, and so religious practice is of making some offerings for those, maybe doing a simple ritual. It might be just a little harmless offering of some rice or something. It might be doing a sacrifice, animal sacrifice, human sacrifice even. But it's a very kind of local, a very kind of low-level religion. It's very simple. People don't think about it very much. It's just there. And when I said it's the world's most popular religion and so on, but it's not even in any censuses, right? If you look at the list of the world's religions, animism actually isn't there, right? But it's practiced by people all over the world. And every village that you go to, pretty much, people are practicing animism, right? They might call themselves Buddhists and tick the box that says Buddhist on the census form, right? But actually a lot of what people are practicing is animism. So this is one of the things which was in ancient India at the time of the Buddha. So there would be like worship of the local yaka or the local naga, right? So each river or lake or something like that would have a naga or a spirit associated with it. A town or something might have a more powerful spirit or yaka. These days we tend to think of a yaka as being a kind of like an ogre or a troll or a monster or something like that. But actually in the Buddha's day, a lot of the yakas were quite dignified characters actually. There's some sculptures of yakas from Mathura 200 or 300 years after the Buddha, and they're quite regal and powerful figures, right? They're not just some kind of monster lurking in the pond waiting to bite your head off, but these were obviously quite kind of powerful spirits who were regarded as the protector deities of that town or that city. And so this is kind of one of the major religious contexts that we find in the time of the Buddha. This is kind of sort of underlying, sort of subterranean kind of animist culture. So this is one level. Now on top of that, we had higher religions emerging from two distinct strands. The first strand was the local culture, and in the local culture around the time of the Buddha, the Magadhan culture and so on, and for a few hundred years beforehand, that animist culture had evolved in a certain direction, and especially it had evolved in a way towards emphasizing some ascetic practice and contemplative practices which were intended to change your consciousness. And probably these practices emerged originally out of like shamanic or witch doctor practices, trances, maybe taking drugs of some kind or doing some kind of invocation or incantation, and it evolved into these various practices which we found taught by a group of teachers called the Shramanas, okay, or Samanas in Pali, Shramanas in Sanskrit. And the Samanas were not, they didn't belong to the Brahmanical tradition at all. They were a very diverse group of teachers, and their main characteristic was that they claimed to be teaching from their own personal experience. Okay, so they had some religious experience which changed them and which they tried to teach to others and to convert others. So that movement, called the Samana movement, was very, very energetic, very vibrant at the time of the Buddha. There were lots of different teachers teaching completely different kinds of things. And we'll have a look at what some of those Samanas had to say in a few minutes. It's from that Samana movement and that local movement that a lot of the ideas that we regard as being uniquely Indian, or even as today as being Hindu, actually came from. So the ideas of the contemplative practices come from the Samana movement. Possibly the idea of Kamma and Rebirth also comes from that movement as well. But by the time of the Buddha, there was already another major religious presence in the region, and that was the Brahmins. Okay, so it's a Brahmanical tradition, which these days we regard as being the Hinduism, and of course there's a connection, there's a continuity of tradition there, but it's not the same thing. And if you compare with the Western tradition, you would say, for example, that Abraham and Moses, they were part of the same tradition, which is also the in the Bible and so on. But you couldn't say that Moses was a Catholic, right? Or Abraham wasn't a Catholic, right? Nor, incidentally, was Jesus. He wasn't a Christian either. But they were practicing from a tradition which evolved and changed over time. So it's the same thing in India. Yeah? So there's a connection between what we have modern day Hinduism and in those days the Brahmanical traditions, but it's not the same thing. Now, what was this Brahmanical tradition? Well, this Brahmanical tradition evolved out of this animist ideas, and the religion moved towards becoming more formalized. They had their own literary texts, which we call the Vedas. Okay, Vedas originally belonged to different families, so each family, right, each clan, would pass down its own religious traditions and would preserve that in memory and pass it down. Now, this is quite a sophisticated cultural product, right? We're talking about highly elaborate, sophisticated verses and poetry which were recited and passed down with extreme accuracy for thousands of years, okay? The Rig Veda was passed down in oral tradition, right? In oral traditions, purely by memory, for perhaps 4,000 years before it was written down, okay? And then with complete accuracy. Okay? So this is a very remarkable cultural product. It shows a very sophisticated level of culture. It's moved beyond that simple kind of animism, right? So we had those Vedas, we had a higher level cultural units emerging, towns and then cities, and we had a formalized religious liturgy, the ritual. This became so important in the Vedic tradition, the performance of the ritual. No longer was the ritual something that anybody could do, a simple offering to a shrine. I go and I'll just put a bit of rice on the shrine and make Anjali and mutter a few words, right? It's very simple, anyone can do it. Ritual became very specialized, right? So you had to have specialists who could do those rituals, and these were the Brahmin priests, right? And they would memorize thousands of verses, so they would know all these verses, they would know the appropriate verses, and the incredible detail in how the rituals were to be performed, at what time and what place, and how you orientate it to the sun, and different people would participate in it, and they'd have different functions in the ritual and so on. So here we've got a religious movement which is much more complex, much more sophisticated than the simple animist movement, right? But still, in that Vedic religion, it still wasn't very philosophical. There's a few beginnings of philosophical ideas there, but mostly it was about the ritual and so on. But as time went on, they began to reflect more and more about this, and they began to ask questions about this ritual. Okay, what happens? If I do this ritual, for example, like the Brahmins would do an incantation every dawn at the rising of the sun, right? And so you do your ritual and the sun rises, okay? Now what happens if you don't do it? Does the sun not rise? Yeah? What happens if you can't make it in time for the ritual? What if your alarm clock doesn't go off and you sleep in? Well, that one would probably be okay because there's Brahmins all over the place doing it, so they wouldn't all sleep in on the same day, right? So, but what would happen if you couldn't do your ritual right? Or what happened if you tried to do it right but you got some of the materials for the ritual wrong, or you made some mistake, right? And then, so the Brahmanical scriptures discuss these things, and they say that if you do the ritual by faith, if you do it even just in your heart, then it can still be effective, right? So you see that they're moving beyond this sort of purely external religious practice to an idea that there is an internal component, right? That actually it's your intention while doing these rituals which is what really matters. And this is one of the major themes in the class of literature called the Upanishads. The Upanishads appeared in the region of the Buddha about 200 years before the Buddha lived. And the Upanishads are a highly philosophical, contemplative and reflective literature. They're very sophisticated and they're very broad in their addressing of different philosophical issues. But the key problem, the key issue which the Upanishads address is the issue of who is the one that knows who is doing the ritual. When you're doing the ritual, what is the mind that you're doing that? One of the most common phrases in the Upanishads is Ya Evam Veda. Ya Evam Veda. It says this constantly through it. One who knows this, right? Ya Evam Veda. One who knows this. So you're doing the ritual, right? Somebody can do the ritual and they're just mindlessly going through the motions and it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any results, okay? It doesn't have any results. But one who knows the secret meaning of the ritual, Ya Evam Veda, who knows what's the hidden meaning behind it, the real purpose behind it. For them, the ritual will have great fruit and be very powerful. Right? So there's this internalizing of religion, which we find in that Brahmanical tradition before the time of the Buddha. So, what does all this have to do with the idea of Kamma? Well, the ritual is Kamma. Okay? The word for ritual in the Vedas is Kamma. Okay, it's one of the words. Right? There's a lot of different words, but this is one of them. Right? So when you're performing a ritual, you are performing a Kamma. Right? Actually, we still use the word in the same sense in Pali. And when the Sangha does various acts of the Sangha, like we recite our rules of discipline, our Patimokkha, then this is called a Sangha Kamma, right? An act of the Sangha. So in a sense, it's kind of like a ritual or kind of like a legal or formal act of the Sangha. So this is what a ritual was. A ritual was a Kamma. What that means is that you're coming together and you're performing an action. And because that action has shape and form and meaning, because it fits in with a pattern which was divinely inspired. Okay, so remember, from the Brahmanical point of view, the Vedas were inspired by God. And these rituals were all laid down by God himself. It wasn't just your idea, we're going to do the ritual like this or like that. You had to do it according to, and you were participating in that divine pattern. You're shaping your energies, your body, your speech, your mind in that direction of that pattern as laid down by God. And by doing that, you're making this very, very powerful Kamma, right? This action which had very powerful results. Okay? So sometimes those results would be conceived in very everyday worldly terms, right? Very often they were, right? So you would do a ritual, for example, to have children, or you do a ritual to have a successful harvest, or you would do a ritual so that your marriage would be successful, or you do a ritual so that your neighbour will die, right? You get that in the Upanishads too, some black magic and things like that as well. There's all kinds of rituals for fertility rituals, like if you want to give your children different characteristics, there's different foods you can eat and things you can do. So if you want your child to be, good looking or intelligent or something like that, then it gives you all these rituals you can do to ensure those things. And so on and so forth. So there's these different, they're acts that are done for the purpose of obtaining some kind of result. Okay, so this idea of karma, cause and effect, right? But what's not there is there's no really an ethical component. Okay, ritual is not an ethical thing. Anybody can do a ritual. It's the same in Buddhism, right? I mean, we can all be terrible people, and we can all come here to the temple and bow down to the Buddha and sadhu, 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 and light the incense and do the chanting, and we can go on and continue being terrible people when we go home, right? I hope that isn't the case, right? I'm sure it's not. The present company is certainly excluded from that, but I know of cases where this definitely happens, right? And so ritual and religious practice doesn't necessarily have any ethical component at all. So this was one of the questions which they began to reflect on, began to bring into it. What's the relationship of ethics to this process, right? How does that affect things? And there's one passage in the Upanishads where there's a discussion about this, and it's very, very interesting because when the question is asked, the teacher takes the student or the questioner by the arm and leads him to one side, away from the crowd. And what does he speak to him about? He speaks to him about Kamma. Yeah? Very interesting, right? This is from the Upanishads, maybe 100 or 200 years before the Buddha. And so this notion of Kamma in an ethical sense, right? That was a secret doctrine at that time. That wasn't something that you could talk about in public, right? That was something you had to whisper quietly in somebody's ear because it was too explosive to mention it publicly. Why? Why? Because it completely undermines the authority of the Brahmanical caste. Okay? That's of course what the Buddha did. By the time of the Buddha, he was able to talk about it openly, and this is what he said. Right? It doesn't matter if you're a Brahmin. Right? It's irrelevant. What matters is how you choose to live, and that is your Kamma. Right? So when the Buddha was using Kamma in this way, right, this is one of the things that he was doing. He was deconstructing, right, the Brahmanical idea of Kamma as ritual. Jetanaham bhikkhave kammang vadami. He was completing that process that the Brahmins had already begun. They'd already begun questioning this notion of Kamma and introducing these ethical ideas into it, but they never really dispensed with the notion of ritual completely. And of course we know even in the Hindu tradition today they still have that, and it's still a contradiction in the Hindu tradition. In just last month they had the Gadamai festival in Nepal. I'm not sure if you know about it, but it's a terrible thing. They butcher hundreds of thousands of animals in this sacrifice to some goddess, all so that they can get wealth and prosperity and so on. It's terrible. And at the same time, Hinduism is a religion that teaches harmlessness. It teaches ahimsa. And how can we reconcile those two things, right? You can't, obviously. Right? Why do those two things coexist? Well, because they're not actually the same religion, really. It's just different kinds of things which get brought under that umbrella that we call Hinduism. So that ritual, the Buddha just wiped it away. And this is one of the most stunning things about the Buddha's teachings, and specifically about the Buddha's teaching of the Eightfold Path, right? It was something we don't really notice. We read the Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. We're so used to it. We've heard it so many times. We're so familiar with those ideas. We don't notice what isn't there. Yeah? Very important. What isn't there? And what isn't there is ritual. Yeah? The Kamma of ritual, it's gone. The Buddha just ignored it. Yeah? And the very some of the famous statements that the Buddha said, one of the Brahmins was saying to him that the bathing in the Ganges will purify you, and the Buddha said if that was the case, then all the fishes and turtles would be enlightened. Yeah? So this is that reform of that idea of ritual which the Buddha was bringing along. So that's one meaning of Kamma. That's one of the reasons why the Buddha used that particular term, Kamma, because he wanted to take it away from the Hindus. He wanted to say, no, what matters, what is how you act, how you live. And of course there's many wonderful verses about this, like in the Dhammapada and other places. Okay, so this is one aspect of Kamma, but I want to come back to the idea of the Samanas, and what were the Samanas teaching. And the Samanas is a very interesting movement. And with the Vedas and the Brahmanical side of things, it's more, it's a bit more normal. Actually, Vedic religion is very similar in many ways to the kind of paganism that you had in Greece and things like that. And it's quite a common kind of religious movement. But when you look at the Samana movement, it seems quite very extraordinary, it's very strange and quite unparalleled to anything we find in other places. And the degree of religious freedom was such that people were teaching and practicing things that would be completely illegal in Australia today. I mean, we like to think of ourselves as being, having religious pluralism and things like that. Well, you try walking naked around the streets of Australia as your religious practice and see how far that gets you, especially if you haven't bathed for 20 years, right? And that's only the beginnings of the completely outrageous things which a lot of these guys were doing. Right? So what I'd like to do is just have a look at some of the teachings of some of these samanas. Now, this is some teachings taken from the Samanyapala Sutta, Digha Nikaya number 2, and this has one of the best known passages dealing with these different samanas. So I won't talk about the sutta too much, that would take me too long to do that, but I'll just read through some of the views of the different samanas. Okay, so the first one is Purana Kassapa. And Purana Kassapa's doctrine, according to the Samanyapala Sutta, I should just note here that, just in passing, that there are quite a few different versions of these teachings. In some cases the views are a bit mixed up or attributed to different people, so there seems to be some textual corruption, but basically the ideas are pretty much similar. So Purana Kassapa, his views. Great king, he's talking to King Ajatasattu. If one acts or induces others to act, mutilates or induces others to mutilate, tortures or makes others torture, inflicts sorrow or makes others inflict sorrow, oppresses or makes others oppress, if one destroys life, takes what is not given, breaks into houses, plunders wealth, commits burglary, ambushes highways, commits adultery and speaks falsehood, one does no evil. If with a razor-edged disc one were to reduce all of the living beings on this earth to a single heap and pile of flesh, by doing so there would be no evil or outcome of evil. If you were to go along the south bank of the Ganges killing and mutilating and torturing and having others do the same things, there would be no evil or outcome of evil. On the other hand, if you were to go along the north bank of the Ganges giving gifts and inducing others to give gifts, making offerings and so on, by doing so there would be no merit or outcome of merit. By giving self-control, restraint and truthful speech, there is no merit or outcome of merit. Wow, right? Imagine you tried to teach that today. Yeah, I can just imagine going along to an interfaith meeting and, everyone talking about their religious beliefs, and then you say that. Everyone would look at you and say, what? Amazing, huh? And of course it immediately raises all these questions, like why, if he thinks there's no benefit to any religious practice, why is he living as a monk for a start? That seems very strange. Right? This guy's an ascetic teacher, what's he doing? If you asked him that question, he would say, I did it not because I'm trying to do any good, but because I have to. It's my destiny, right? So I don't have any choice. So this is just one of the views. I mentioned earlier that not all of the ascetics in the time of the Buddha accepted the notion of karma and rebirth. Well, here's one example. Purana Kassapa is completely rejecting not only the notion of karma in any sense, but any kind of idea of doing good and evil whatsoever. That's a very radical teaching. Okay, here's another one. Makkhali Gosala. Elsewhere the Buddha said, of all the people born in the world, the Makkhali Gosala is the most harmful. Great king, there is no cause or condition for the defilement of beings. Beings are defiled without any cause or condition. There is no cause or condition for the purification of beings. There is no self-determination, no determination by others, no personal determination. That's a bit of an obscure translation there, but basically what it means is that there's no making of choices, there's no free will. There is no power, no energy, no personal strength, no personal fortitude. All sentient beings, all living beings, all creatures, all souls are helpless, powerless, devoid of energy. By undergoing transformation by destiny, circumstance and nature, they experience pleasure and pain in the 6 classes of men. Right? So this is a doctrine of predestination. Okay? What you do makes no difference. Your choices are irrelevant. Yeah? That's all there is. Yeah? So again, notice how I talked earlier about how Kamma is a very empowering teaching. This teaching is completely disempowering. It's a fatalistic teaching. He then goes on to talk about his teaching in quite a lot more detail. There are 1,400,000 principal modes of origin for living beings and 6,600 others. There are 500 kinds of Kamma and 5 kinds of Kamma and 3 kinds of Kamma and full Kamma and half Kamma. There are 62 pathways, 62 sub-eons, 6 classes of men, 8 stages in the life of man, 4,900 modes of livelihood, 4,900 kinds of wanderers, 4,900 abodes of nagas, 2,000 faculties, 3,000 hells, 36 realms of dust, 7 spheres of percipient beings, 7 spheres of non-percipient beings, 7 kinds of jointed plants, 7 kinds of gods, 7 kinds of human beings, 7 kinds of demons, 7 great lakes, 7 major kinds of knots, 700 minor kinds of knots, 7 major cliffs, 700 minor cliffs, 7 major dreams, 700 minor dreams, 8,400,000 eons. The foolish and the wise, having roamed and wandered through all of these, will alike make an end to suffering. But one might think, by this moral discipline or observance or austerity or holy life, I will ripen unripened Kamma and eliminate ripened Kamma whenever it comes up. That cannot be. For pleasure and pain are measured out. Samsara's limits are fixed, and they can be neither shortened nor extended. There is no advancing forward and no falling back. Just as when a ball of string is thrown, it rolls along, unwinding until it comes to its end. In the same way, the foolish and the wise roam and wander through samsara, after which they make an end of suffering. Right? So this is a very kind of interesting teaching. This whole kind of inducing this whole thing of fatalism, right? There's this whole world, you just go on through it. You don't have any choice in the matter, right? So in this teaching, he accepts the idea of rebirth, right? So you're going to get reborn, but there's no idea of Kamma, there's no energy. You just keep on going. It talked about Kamma there, but it's obviously not talking about Kamma in the sense that we understand it. So that's it. Samsara is fixed, so there's no point in practicing, no point in doing anything. You might as well go home. Yeah? If you go home, you were destined to do that, right? If you go and climb Mount Everest, it was just your destiny to do that. You shouldn't get any awards for doing that. If you win a Nobel Prize, it was just your destiny. Yeah? If you go and kill yourself, it's just your destiny. Yeah? No problem. You can go and shoot up drugs, it's not a problem. Yeah? It's just your destiny, it's not your doing that. You can go and be the kindest person in the world, you're not doing any good by that. So this is that teaching which is, not very comforting. So let's put it mildly. Okay, then there's another teaching. This one's Ajita Kesa Kambala, right? Ajita Kesa Kambala. Kesa Kambala means a hair blanket. Okay, hair blanket. So that means you weave a blanket out of human hair. And the Buddha said that of all the kinds of clothes that you can make, the blanket of human hair is the most uncomfortable. It's cold in winter and hot in summer and scratchy and itchy. You know. Okay, so Ajita Kesa Kambala. There is no giving, no fruit or result of good and bad actions. Right? So he's just denying Kamma outright. There is no present world, no world beyond, no mother and father, no beings who have taken rebirth. So he's denying rebirth as well. In the world there are no recluses and Brahmins of right attainment and right practice to explain this world and the world beyond on the basis of their own direct knowledge and realization. So these first phrases are the usual definition in Buddhism of wrong view. So this is sort of an explicit statement of exactly the opposite of what the Buddha taught. A person is composed of the 4 main elements. When he dies, the earth merges with the earth, the water merges with water, the fire returns to fire, the air returns to air. So this is a bit like in kind of Western funeral liturgy, you say, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So this is the same kind of idea, except it's not. It's just saying that that there's nothing other than these physical things. The sense faculties pass over into space. 4 men carry the corpse along on a bier. His eulogies are sounded till they reach the charnel ground. His bones turn pigeon-coloured. His meritorious offerings end in ashes. The practice of giving is a doctrine of fools. Those who declare that there is an afterlife speak only false, empty prattle. with the breaking up of the body, the foolish and the wise alike are annihilated and utterly perish. They do not exist after death. Okay? Ajita kesa kambala. So, another very kind of challenging idea. This one is one which is perhaps not so unfamiliar, right? In fact, it sounds very similar to what we hear as a very kind of mainstream view today, which is a view of a materialist view, right? So scientific materialism basically has a similar idea. They might express it a bit differently, but the basic idea is the same, is that all there is the physical elements, and they're combined, and the what we call consciousness and sense activity and so on is nothing more than a property that emerges from those things. After we die, that all disappears, and there's nothing to life after death, right? So this was another one of those views which the Buddha was very explicitly opposed to. Okay, next one. Pakuda Katchayana. There are 7 bodies that are unmade, unfashioned, uncreated, without a creator, barren, stable as a mountain peak, standing firm like a pillar. They do not alter or change or obstruct each other. They are incapable of causing one another either pleasure or pain. What are the 7? The body of earth, the body of water, the body of fire, the body of air, pleasure, pain, and soul as the 7th. So there is no killer or hearer or cognizer. If one was to cut off another person's head with a sharp sword, he would not be taking the other person's life. The sword merely passes through the space between the 7 bodies. Right? Yeah? Interesting, right? So this is a kind of eternalist view. It's the idea that reality is changeless, right? That everything is really, the reality of everything is always changeless, and that what we perceive as being changed is merely an illusion. Right? Actually, there are very similar ideas some of the Greek philosophers taught, but this is, from an Indian point of view, again, completely undermines a kind of morality, doesn't it? You're just passing your sword through the space between the 7 bodies. Okay, then there's the doctrine of Niganthanata Putta. He's a Jain teacher. I might just miss over that one. And then finally is my favourite one is Sanjaya Balatiputta, who the Buddha described, or the king of Jatasattu actually describes as being the most foolish of all of these samanas and brahmins. And his doctrine is this: if you ask me, is there a world beyond? If I thought there was a world beyond, I would declare to you there is. But I do not say it is this way, or it is that way, or it is otherwise. I do not say it is not so, nor do I say it is not so. Okay? If you ask me, is there no world beyond? Well, if I thought that there was no world beyond, I would say so, but I don't say it this way, I don't say it's not, I don't say it's otherwise, I don't say it's not so, nor do I say that it's not so. And so on and so forth, for all of the questions about rebirth and so on and so forth. I do not say it so, nor do I say it is not so. And for all of these ones, of course, all the teachings that the Buddha rejected. So this is the idea that it's like a kind of radical agnosticism. Okay, so it's the idea that we can't make any positive assertions about the nature of the world. And so this is like the other kinds of views. Excessive certainty, right, is one of the things that the Buddha rejected, but excessive skepticism is also another thing that the Buddha rejected. And the Buddha did affirm that we can know, right? We can't necessarily know perfectly. We can't be completely confident all the time that everything we know is correct, but we can know well enough. Yeah, this is the important point. Not whether our knowledge is perfect, but whether it's good enough. And so this is the rejection of that doctrine of Sanjaya Balatiputta. Now, I skipped over the Jain view, and the reason for that was because there's a better discussion of that in another sutta, and this is in the Devadaha Sutta, and I'll just read here a bit about the Jain view. So this is perhaps one of the most important ones to understand in the context of the Buddha's teachings on karma. So, the Buddha's talking to the monks, and he says, there are some Brahmins and contemplatives who teach in this way: whatever a person experiences, whether pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain, all is caused by what is done in the past. Okay? So this is the Pubbe Kata Hetu Vada, the doctrine that everything is caused by what was done in the past. So with the ending of old Kamma by doing ascetic practices, and with not doing new Kamma, there will be no results in the future. With no results in the future, there is the ending of Kamma. With the ending of Kamma, the ending of suffering. With the ending of suffering, the ending of feeling. With the ending of feeling, all suffering will be ended. Such is the teaching of the Jains. Okay, in the Buddhist text, the Jains are referred to as Nigantas. So, the Buddha goes on. Going up to the Jains, or the Nigantas, I asked them, is it true, friends, that you teach in this way? And when I asked them, they agree, yes, that's what we teach. And so I say to them, but friends, do you know that you existed in the past and that you did not exist? So this is referring, of course, to past lives, right? No, we can't know for sure that we existed in past lives. Well, do you know that you did bad Kamma in the past? Well, no, friend. Do you know that you did such and such kind of bad Kamma in the past? Well, no, friend. Do you know that so much suffering is ended, or that such and such amount of suffering remains to be ended, or that with the ending of so much suffering, all of suffering will be ended? Well, no, actually we don't know that either. Well, do you know what is the abandoning of unskillful mental qualities and the developing of skillful mental qualities in the here and now? No, we don't know about that either. So it seems you don't know any of these things. And yet this is your teaching. Yeah? And the Buddha went on to give a simile. He said, my friend Nigantas, it's a man was shot with an arrow, thickly smeared with poison. And when he felt those feelings, he would feel fierce, sharp, racking pains. His friends and kinsmen would go and take him to the doctor. The doctor would cut around the opening of the wound with a knife, and then he'd feel even more pain. Then the surgeon would probe the arrow with the probe, and he'd still feel even more pain. Then he would pull out the arrow, and he would feel more pain. And later on, the wound would be healed and covered with skin, and he would be well and happy. And it would occur to him, before I was shot with an arrow, thickly smeared with poison. When I was shot, I felt those painful feelings, but now the arrow is drawn out, the wound is healed, it's covered with skin, I am well and happy, and I'm able to go wherever I like. So in the same way, if you knew that about... so the Buddha goes on and makes the argument that if you knew that you'd done these bad karma in the past and this was how to make it go away and so on, then this would make sense. You would be able to heal it like that man did, but you don't know those things. And then Nigantas responded to him and says, well, we don't know those things, but our teacher, the Nigantanataputta, is all-knowing and all-seeing, and he claims total knowledge and vision. And he tells us that he teaches us this doctrine, and this is why we believe it and we approve of it. And the Buddha goes on to say, well, my friend Nigantas, there are 5 kinds of things that might turn out 2 ways here and now. And the same 5 teachings that we're familiar with from the Kalama Sutta: faith, preference, oral tradition, reasoning, and acceptance of a view by pondering. So they might be true or they might be false. The Buddha then goes on to ask the Nigantas, friend Nigantas, what do you think? When there is fierce striving, fierce exertion, do you feel fierce, sharp, racking pains from the harsh treatment? And when there is no fierce striving and fierce exertion, do you feel no sharp and racking pains from the harsh treatment? Yes, friend. So it's not proper for you to assert that whatever you experience is caused by what is done in the past. So this again is this is kind of, notice how the Buddha's arguing. He's pointing to their experience. When you do the actions, you feel the results. And then goes on, I won't go through the whole discussion with the Jains. He then goes on to say, if it was really true that everything we experience is due to what happens in the past, right, then it must be the case that the Jains have done lots of bad karma in the past, right, because they're experiencing all of these painful feelings, right? Whereas myself, the Buddha's talking to himself, he says, I must have done lots of good karma in the past because I'm really happy, right? And I'm not experiencing all this pain. So obviously you Jain guys have done all the bad karma and I've done all the good karma in the past. Yeah? So, okay, so I think that should be all the way. won't go through the whole sutta, so we're just sort of discussing a few aspects of the views here. So I think you're getting some kind of sense for what the teachings on Kamma were and what the teachings on the kind of the environment that the Buddha was surrounded in when he was teaching there. Now, I'd like to just look at one more sutta and to come back to the Brahmanical teachings and the teachings of the ritual and how this was addressed by the Buddha, because it's a very, very good idea of how skillful that he could do these things. And this is from a wonderful sutta in the Digha Nikaya called the Kutta Danta Sutta. And this is a conversation between the Buddha and a Brahmin. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole sutta, but just read a few excerpts from it. Okay, so the king has been, the king is seeking advice on how to live, and there's been some advice that the king should do some kind of sacrifice or something to make the country safe. But the king had a wise advisor, Brahmin advisor, who said to him, "The king's countryside is harassed and harried. There are bandits around who pillage the villages and make the roads unsafe." If the king, when the situations like this, were to give a fresh tax to the people, this would be the wrong thing to do. Right? If you were to think, I'll put a stop to these scoundrels by punishing them and fining them and killing them, then that wouldn't work either, because there'd always be some left over and they would still go on harassing the realm. Now, there is one method to put an end to this disorder. Whoever there is in the king's realm who devote themselves to keeping cattle and the farming, to them let His Majesty the King give food and seed corn. Whoever there is in the king's realm who devote themselves to trade, to them let His Majesty the King give capital. Whoever there is in the king's realm who devote themselves to government service, to them let His Majesty the King give wages and food. And then those men following each his own business will no longer harass the realm, the king's revenue will go up, the country will be quiet and at peace, and the populace, pleased with one another and happy, dancing their children in their arms, will dwell with open doors. Yeah, very lovely picture of a happy and harmonious country there, and a great example of a Buddhist social policy, right? Rather than having a social policy based on punishment and so on, you have a social policy that's based on the positive encouragement of the good things that people are actually doing. It's a recognition that actually most people want to just get on with their lives, and they want to have a job and a livelihood and a living, and if you encourage and support them to do that, then mostly people will get along okay. That's actually a great piece of social advice. So the king did all of those things, and then afterwards he said he wanted to do a sacrifice, and he got all of these advisors and so on that came, and I'll just sort of go down here. And it describes the sacrifice that was given. So it says at that sacrifice there weren't any oxen slain, no goats, no fowls, no fatted pigs, and no kind of living creatures were put to death. No trees were cut down to be used as posts. No grasses were mown to strew around the sacrificial spot. Yeah? Very interesting, isn't it? Yeah? It's not only, the Buddha was not only saying don't sacrifice animals at the sacrifice, right? He's even saying don't cut the grass, right? Don't cut the trees down. Right? And the slaves and messengers and workmen employed there were driven neither by rods nor fear, nor carried out their work, weeping with tears on their faces. Whoever chose to help, he worked. Whoever didn't choose to work, he did not. Whatever you chose to do, you did. And what you chose not to do, that was left undone. Yeah? Wow, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? Yeah? What kind of world would that be if people just did the things that they wanted to do and didn't do the things that they didn't want to do? Yeah? And if they didn't want to do it, it got left undone. That's what a great kind of attitude that is. So they just did the sacrifice with ghee and oil, butter and sugar. And the lords came up to the king, offered him their wealth, and the king said, "I've got enough wealth. Okay, you keep that." So they wanted to give the money away, so they set up a charity on the basis of that. Okay, so... But then the point of that story is that then this is being told about a story of the past, and then they ask the Buddha, but is there any other sacrifice less difficult and less troublesome with better fruit and better advantage than this? So again, notice the idea that sacrifice is still an act and it has a fruit, a karma and a result. And so the Buddha says, yes, there is, and it's making an offering to the monks, offering a vihara to the sangha, and then but is a greater kind of sacrifice. But then, of course, practicing the Dhamma and realizing liberation is an even better sacrifice that has a better result than the one before. So. Here we find in the Buddhist suttas, it's like a quite explicit adoption of these Brahmanical ideas, the sacrifice, the ritual, and so on. So first thing you do is you transform them, you take away all the painful and harmful elements of them, and so on. And so you can do those rituals if you like, right? So if these are rituals which don't cause any harm to anybody, that's all right. You want to do that, fine, it's not a problem. But is it particularly valuable? Well, no, not really. But the real sacrifice, which is really meaningful, is first of all doing charity and donations. It's actually going to be meaningful. And even more so to do that practice of meditating and abandoning defilements in your own heart. So this is something which is still, I think, very valuable and very important within the Buddhist tradition. I remember one time when I was going for alms in a village in Thailand, and it was a special day, some kind of ceremony or something like that. This is this little village in the back of nowhere in northern Thailand. And here I was going for alms, and there was no villagers around that day. I was wondering, where is everybody? And there was like a field on the outside of the village, and all the villagers were in there, and they were doing this ceremony. And they had a big table set up with like 4 bowls on the table. And they were all coming and making offerings to these bowls, right? And their table was literally overflowing with these mountains of food that they were offering to this table. But there weren't any monks there, right? And here I was, like an actual monk, with an actual stomach, actually wanting to be filled, standing outside the gate, hello, anybody? Some rice, please. Right? And so this is how it comes, yeah? So we forget, these things become like rituals, they become meaningless. So we want to practice Dhamma, do what's meaningful, and we practice good karma within the context of Dhamma. So this is just a few little details, but hopefully it's giving you some idea what that religious culture was like in the time of the Buddha, why the Buddha spoke in the way that he did, what kind of changes did he want to make, how was he communicating to the people in that time and that place, right? These are the important things, right? And so from this is enough for this session on the context in the time of the Buddha, and for the next session we'll come and we'll have a look more closely at what the Buddha's teachings on Kamma and rebirth were. So thank you very much for your attention and for your time for this session.